Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome on this snowy, cold day. At least it is here in Central Ohio. I'm Sue Hedrick. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Disability Empowerment. Just a little bit about us. We are a non-residential, community-based agency. We're driven by the choice and direction of people with disabilities. We serve anyone with any kind of disability of any age. And our goal is to help them to be more independent, more engaged in their communities, and participants and contributors in those communities. And that gives rise to our series. This is the third in a series of 5 that we are thrilled to be hosting. That is going to hopefully move us to have more inclusive, welcoming communities. We spent our first 2 sessions kind of laying the groundwork for this. And beginning today, we're going to get more into the idea of strategies, how we can make this happen. There is no one more equipped to address this topic than Al Condeluci. Dr. Condeluci has been involved in building inclusive communities for more than 50 years. He has a PhD from the University of Pittsburgh, and he was the CEO of a major nonprofit community building organization in Pittsburgh from 1973 to 2019. And he's authored, I guess at least 7 books, correct me if I'm wrong, Al, on this topic. And was just telling us he is authoring yet another one, which can't wait to get our hands on. So with that, I'll turn it over to Al. One more thing. If you do have questions, put them in the chat. And Al, you might want to tweak this a little bit, but I think for the most part, we're going to allow the Q&A at the end of the session. So with that, Al, it's all yours.
Great, Sue, thanks so much. And welcome everyone to the third in our series of looking at community engagement and meaningful participation in community for all people. I'm Al Condeluci, as Sue indicated, and I'm really excited to be working with the Center for Disability Empowerment on this program. Hopefully, you've been with us for the first 2 sessions. We had almost a record-shattering 170 or so folks sign up for our session today. So glad that you're with us. Glad that you're keeping on. And this session really marks an interesting shift for us. If you have been participating in the series from the beginning, you know that our very first session focused in on social isolation and loneliness. And we looked at that phenomena generically. And then we really began to focus in on how vulnerable people, and certainly folks that are experiencing disabilities, fall into that category, but not just people with disabilities. Folks with other kind of vulnerabilities are equally at risk of being isolated and rendered lonely. Elders, folks who live in poverty, folks that find themselves in some minority group are all higher risk factors for isolation and loneliness. But one of the things you might remember from that session was that even pre-pandemic, and even taking out the risk factors of groups of people who are more vulnerable, we know that isolation and loneliness have been on the rise in our society and around the world. And so when we focused in on that topic, we really looked at how isolation and loneliness can really be lethal, how they can wreak havoc both systemically on an individual and certainly socially on individuals in terms of the risk factor. As we sharpened our pencils in thinking about isolation and loneliness, we introduced our second program, which we did last month, which really got into the antidote to dealing with isolation and loneliness, which is building relationships and building meaningful relationships, and how social capital, which was the topic of our second webinar, is really the goal. The more social capital people build, the greater the opportunities and possibilities are in their lives. And we looked at some of that data, and we focused in on some of the steps and stages to building relationships. Our session today continues the Odyssey, but now we're really moving from the micro side, that is thinking about individuals who might be lonely or isolated, thinking about how individuals might build relationships. That's sort of micro thinking. And now we're really going to begin to shift gears and start to focus in on the macro side, and that is the community side. Obviously, the answer to isolation and loneliness is having meaningful engagement opportunities to build relationships. And through those relationships, one becomes less lonely and feels less isolated in their lives. However, that just doesn't happen by snapping our fingers, right? Because the target, if you will, for building relationships is found in the community. And so this session is really going to take a look at the community mapping process. That is how we can get our hands around our own communities, begin to understand them a little bit better, and then, in fact, begin to think about how those community resources, the places and spaces out there in our community, can become viable, exciting opportunities for people to engage. Okay, so with that in mind, a little let me just reiterate some of what Sue mentioned. As we go through this material, and we're going to spend about 50 minutes, 45 minutes just sharing some of the content here. And some of this is going to be new. Some of this is going to be perhaps different than most human service advocates are used to dealing with, because even though we perceive ourselves, many of us who work in human services perceive ourselves as being community oriented, many of us haven't really thought about our communities. I mean, really strategized and analyzed our communities. And so this session is really moves us into that direction. And so with that in mind, let's talk a little bit about community and the community mapping process. I want to start off though with a quote from a fellow Ohioan, Peter Block, who's out of Cincinnati, and some of you may be familiar with Peter Block's work. Some amazing stuff that he's done. One book that's just right here on my desk, I usually keep it pretty handy, is a book by Peter Block called Community: The Structure of Belonging. It's a wonderful overview of community. But Block says the community is the container within which our longing to be is fulfilled. Without connectedness of community, we will continue to choose not to be. That's a really powerful and I think fundamental examination of the essence of community. It really fulfills this longing to be. That's where we find those answers. And community is really intriguing, because we oftentimes, when we say the word community, we think geography, right? We think, well, I live in Columbus, or that's my community, or Westerville is my community, or or Pittsburgh is my community. And so we think about a geography, and obviously there is a geography around community. I mean, there is some parameters that we can use to script a community. But community is more about gathering than it is about a geography, right? And as we begin to examine this, when we think about geography, this little cartoon from Gary Larson's Far Side, kind of caught my eye, and it's a caption of a fella and his son standing in their yard by their fence in their backyard, looking up at a sparrow in the tree that's singing, and the father says to the son, "And now, Randy, by use of song, the male sparrow will stake out his territory, an instinct common in the lower animals." And but in the picture, there's fences all around and people staking out their territory. And one of the things about territory is that it is a part of sort of our essence as animals, to literally stake out our property. And any one of us on this phone call today, on this Zoom call, probably have some property that we either own or that we're responsible for. And it's our space and it's our territory. And we guard it. We take care of it. We sometimes compare and contrast it with our neighbor's territory. And territory has really always been sort of interwoven into this notion of community. Years ago, I remember reading a book by Robert Ardrey called A Territorial Imperative. Ardrey is an anthropologist and an ethnologist who really looks at territory and how it's so critical. So when we think about community, territory is a piece of it. Um, However, there's so many other variations of it, and when we find ourselves, wanting to better understand our community, we recognize that there's all kinds of other facets, and we'll get into that issue. And this quote from Einstein has always been instructive to me. It's the significant problems we face today can't be solved at the same level we were at when we created them. Right? And so if we think about any of us who are advocates on this call, advocating that people have more opportunity to be engaged and have meaningful experiences in community, in our field, have to recognize that we really can't solve that problem or deal with that problem unless we move to another paradigm, right? And I think what Einstein is really talking about is paradigm shifting in order to understand and solve issues. And so for most of us in as advocates, most of our energy, and we talked a lot about this last session, was in micro interpretation, thinking about the person with a disability, and it's their issue that we have to sort of deal with, because you really can't be engaged unless you physically have the possibility of being engaged. And so let's deal with that first. That's a micro interpretation. However, that hasn't really solved the engagement issue. We know that people are less engaged. People with disabilities are even further isolated and rendered offset. And so, in thinking about community and getting us started for the understanding the mapping process, here's a definition. The community is a network of different people who come together regularly for something in common, right? Now, this definition can imply geography or territory, but it doesn't necessarily have to, right? We know that community can be found anywhere people gather around something in common. And so with those kinds of things in mind, here are some further delineations of community, right? we know that community more often than not, when we think about community, we think about it as an actual place, a gathering place, a live gathering place for either formal or informal groupings of people who have some social obligation and some common issues that they're interested in. So, community, when we think about it, oftentimes we think about it from a live or an actual perspective. However, the pandemic has really, gotten each of us to understand that another side of community is virtuality. That our gathering today, here we are, 150 of us or so gathered on a Zoom call, and we're each in our own setting, wherever it might be, in our living room or in our office or somewhere distant from one another. And through the virtuality of the platform of Zoom, we have gathered, right? And we're gathered around a common interest, right? We're gathered because we really want to see more meaningful possibilities for all people in terms of engaging in community. So virtual community really, is a viable phenomena that we can't dismiss. We have to recognize and respect it. On the other side of the coin, we also know that virtual community only goes so far in scratching our itch of belonging, right? That sooner or later we want to be with each other. I mean, if the pandemic has taught any of us a frustrating fact, this sort of notion of being distant from folks hurts. It really is it is a struggle, right? Now, one last dimension here before we just start jumping right into what is community mapping, what does it look like, how do you do it, um, is that communities can be urban, suburban, or rural, right? I mean, those are some quick delineations we often think about. Well, he lives in rural Ohio. His community, his village is in a rural sort of a setting, or suburban, which is sort of the outposts of our urban centers. And then, of course, urban, which is the density of cities. Now, each of these domains, have pluses and minuses as it relates to belonging. For example, in urban settings, there may be more opportunity for engagement, but there might also be, more sort of sense of distance or maybe fear of stranger or suspicion that sometimes can happen in dense settings. All the way, of course, to rural settings where distance is a huge issue. You got to travel oftentimes far and wide in order to engage with people if you want to engage in an actual kind of a way. So we want to just be cognizant of those things, but recognize that mapping is a targeted process that really identifies a selected area. And we'll get into that in a moment. There's a bit more about community. And again, because communities serve different functions for us. Here, in this slide, we see, one of the functions is as a sociability center where people socialize with their neighbors or with folks that they have some proximation to and with. Also, communities can really offer interpersonal, impact and mutual aid, where neighbors watch out for neighbors, and if a storm comes and ravages a community, neighbors, get on and help one another through that that challenge. But also communities can function as an organizational base, based on a common need, or can even be perceived as a reference group or a status symbol. In our city of Pittsburgh, in my city of Pittsburgh, um, there are some communities that are really higher socioeconomic, and they're really perceived to be hip communities. There's a status to living in Shady Side, for example, than in McKees Rocks, my community, which is, much more blue collar, much more, pedestrian as that goes. So some people might, in fact, use community to enhance their status, and or the stereotype or the image that follows from someone living in a particular community. These functions of community, they're important to keep in mind, but from a mapping point of view, they really don't get in the way. The reason why, and the functionality that people look for in community is a very kind of a personal thing. And from a mapping agenda, we really kind of look at this much more from a sense of where are the resources, where are the places and spaces that might be useful to an individual who lives in that community. So just here's some delineation of terms, right? Social capital, we talked about last session. That's the value we get from our relationships. Social infrastructure is a topic we're going to focus in on next month. And social infrastructure is really understanding and delineating the elements of community, rituals and patterns and jargon and the memory and those kinds of things we're going to look at next session when we focus in on softening the social infrastructure. Community mapping, which is our agenda today, is the process of identifying the myriad of social infrastructure in our community and beginning to kind of get our hands around what's available and where are the places and the spaces. Now, obviously, thinking about community mapping gets us into understanding culture, understanding anthropology a bit, because those are sort of some of the theoretical elements that are part and parcel of understanding the physicality of community. Margaret Mead famously said, if we are to achieve a richer culture, rich in contrasting values, we must recognize the whole gamut of human potentiality and so weave an arbitrary social fabric, one in which each diverse human gift will find a fitting place. And so, wonderful aspiration about what community can be, what community can do. And there's been efforts at building intentional communities that do just this. Let me just an example. Just 2 years ago, I was invited to do some work and some research in New Zealand, and and it was a wonderful opportunity to to examine and be among colleagues and friends in a different kind of culture and get a sense of that. And one of during this during this sabbatical, if you will, we visited a couple intentional communities in and around Auckland. And these intentional communities were really designed to do exactly what Margaret Mead is saying in this quote, and that is to create a fabric effect where people bring their differing assets and their differing energies to a collection of people and in that process, create a fabric effect that really is dynamic. And this one community, I remember that we had dinner. We went and they invited us for dinner because it was designed where people had their own private homes in this concentric sort of setting, and right in the middle was a community center, and some gardens that were communal, and so the dinner we had was, from the communal garden, and in the community center there was a piano, and we, after we ate, we sat around and we sang, and so there was a kind of an energy there that was really designed to bring out some of the best in what each person brings to the community. So what is community mapping, right? And community mapping has been with us as a process for a lot of years. There's been lots of work done in community development and civic development, agendas, right? So, and in fact, at Northwestern, in Chicago, the Asset-Based Community Development Center, the ABCD Center, has been at this for lots of years, and I really was fortunate to have an opportunity to meet and learn from some of the amazing folks at the ABCD Center, and there was a manual that, in fact, I have it right here, handy dandy manual called "Building Community from the Inside Out," which basically talks about finding and then mapping the assets of community. But community mapping is a process by which we come to discover elements of the community. It results in listing or identifying on a map or in a database the places and spaces where resources exist and where people gather around important issues important to them in that community. It identifies both the formal and informal aspects of community, and we'll talk a little bit about what differentiates formal from informal. But it's a process by which we sort of get to understand a community. Now, there are some core theories in community mapping in a generic sense, and some of these just come along with our with the process. But it's important to recognize that most mapping efforts are really asset based. They're really designed not to find the problems in community, but to find the gifts and talents of community, right? And finding the problems of community is a classic sort of micro approach at trying to fix community, where community members look for problems in their community. We have a gang problem, we have a drug problem, we have this problem, we have that problem, and try to fix the problem. It's a classic micro approach. An asset-based theory is really looking for what is the vibrancy of a community. Even a very poor community where there are problems has a whole variety of potential assets and resources. The other core theory of community mapping is that relationships really matter. And that's really the primary driving force, I think, for us in this webinar series, is to really think about where can you build relationships, right? Where in the community might people who want to participate, want to be involved, where can they build connections? And then this inside out idea, that the title of that book that I just showed you a minute ago is Building Community from the Inside Out, is to say already in community there's this incredible vibrancy. So let's discover it, rather than to say, what do we need to bring in the community? More police, we need to bring in, drug counseling. And so the notion of discovering what's already there, some of the core theories behind the generic agenda of community mapping. And again, from a generic sense, there are steps in the mapping process, right? So you want to define the boundaries. What are you talking about in terms of community? Give an example. I'm working with a group in Sault Ste. Marie that is really doing a very, very intentional mapping of their community. And the boundaries that we're doing there is the boundaries around some of the people that they support, who they really want to get more engaged, right? So it's really kind of like a concentric thinking around what exists, who are the neighbors, what are the resources fairly close at hand, right? And so kind of defining your community, and then the boundaries become step one. Convening a mapping group, right? In Sault Ste. Marie, we're identifying a community advisory council that's going to really help us with this process. And we're identifying some of the folks in that community who are influential in an effort to really help us ferret some of these out. Getting organized. Community mapping is really a formal process. It's just not, you got to be organized. You got to determine how are you going to gather data, what data really matters, what are the methodologies of gathering the data. We'll talk about some of that when we focus in just a bit more. And then from the effort, once we gather the information, whether we interview people, survey, call people, talk to other people, we want to create a database. Now, sometimes this can be created in an actual map, where you literally can identify on this street and on that street where these assets and these potential gathering places are. Other methodologies use a database, and I'll talk about both of those as we move through this. And then activate a plan to impact a particular target group. Like what is the whole rationale for doing this? In Sault Ste. Marie, for example, we have identified a test group of folks with significant disabilities, and that's our target group. We want to map the community so that those men and women have greater opportunity for community engagement. Now, we know that there are, target groups who are at risk of being isolated or left behind, or not contributing in their communities. And so, number of communities have, done processes around that. I mentioned Sault Ste. Marie in the project that we're doing right now in Ontario. But just a couple years ago, about 8-9 years ago in Sault Ste. Marie, there was a community development effort to welcome immigrants, to build, a workforce base that's vibrant, to build, contributors, people who really want to stake their roots in Sault Ste. Marie. So there can be a whole variety of reasons where these target group folks that you see on this slide. Now, obviously, for many of us on this call, folks with disabilities really becomes an area of focus, right? But community mapping can benefit any group that might be at risk, or can generally enhance a community without any particular targeted group. So let's talk a little bit about when we think about dimensions of community, what would we map? what would we identify? Um, here's a listing that comes out of, some of the work done at the Asset-Based Community Development Center, right? That in communities, there's associations and clubs. There are institutions that are there. There's generic community space, um, both indoor and outdoor. Um, there are people who gather around affinity groups. Um, there's local economy, businesses, and commerce, banks, and there are individual residents, right? So those are dimensions. But here's an example when you think about associations, right? And we know that every community has associations of people who associate together, have formed some obligation to one another to advance an agenda, right? So here's a listing of some of the things that animal care groups, business organizations. I just talked to the Pittsburgh Marketing Association in setting up a webinar that I'm going to do for them on isolation and loneliness. They were interested in that as an issue, but that's a business organization. Now, the members of that organization are marketers and advertisers who joined that trade association. Charitable groups, all different types and levels. Civic event groups, parade planning, and regatta. We have a big regatta in Pittsburgh on our rivers in August, and there's events that are planned. The Three Rivers Arts Festival, which we do every June. These are groups of people in community who come together to do something to help their community, right? Churches, educational groups, environmental groups, those are some examples of associations. Similarly, every community has some fabric of institutions, formal institutions, schools and colleges and hospitals, libraries, museums, police and fire departments. These are kind of institutional settings that prop up community, and they're there to serve the community. Affinity groups, clubs, groups, and associations, book clubs. And book clubs, by the way, can be actual. I was a member of a book club at Barnes and Noble that pre-pandemic was really great. People gathered and we read a book together, and I have been involved in a book club that is sponsored by NPR, National Public Radio, where people plug in to a book and then weigh in through one of the NPR tentacles. Coffee clatches, block clubs, religious clubs, any type of affinity leagues, bowling leagues. I mean, these are all examples of affinity groups. And then, of course, community generically has both outdoor and indoor spaces that are a little bit more public. They're more available to anyone who wants to take advantage of them. So on the left side of this slide are the physical sort of places, gardens and parks and fishing spots and picnic areas and hiking paths. These are all, community assets that are physical in nature and available for people to take advantage of. On the other side, on the right side of this slide, are some some spaces that are indoor, but also serve as gathering places, coffee shops, diners, community centers, rec centers. These are all within the realm of possibility when we're thinking about mapping in a generic sense. Again, remember we're talking about this in a broad sense. That every community, again, whether it's rural, urban, suburban, has some kind of an economy around it, and where businesses and merchants and there's banking and there's some enterprising that happens in that community. And then, just general local resources, right? Daycare centers, art galleries, restaurants, bakeries. These are just, again, they're just examples to try to expand your thinking when you begin to say, what community do I want to look at, and what is going to be best for the persons that we serve? Because in the end, this is really all about enhancing the engagement possibilities for folks that might have been left behind or isolated. um, and so it's to promote engagement. That's the whole rationale of why we're even thinking about how do we delineate or measure what exists in our communities.
Quick.
Baranasi,
Um,
pardon me? Oh,
Al, we have a question in the chat if you don't mind me posing that question right now.
sure. Let's take it. I may answer some things before, but what's the chat, Jamie?
So Kimberly says, what happens when the community exists simply by lack of choice and imposed boundaries?
Mhm. Yeah. Well, I mean, that can be as isolating as being institutionalized, when there is, limits placed on people in community. On the other side of that question, however, is that, what I'm trying to lay out here is a broader sense of what might be an asset or a resource, even in a community that might be, monolithic, or might be confined. There are assets and there are potentials. Let me continue on and see if we can identify, and I'll show that. I'm going to actually show a form that we've used in some of the other mapping processes that we've done in terms of looking for places and spaces where people can engage, right? Because this quote, which is a segue quote, is really talks about the fact that we're not locked into our environment, that our imagination, subtleties, toughnesses make it possible to not just accept the environment, but to change it. And that, I think, is really, and the question that came out of the chat room sounded like, somebody was handcuffed and really had no options. And people might be in those kinds of realities, but this quote, I think, for me is aspirational in that we can become involved in, managing and creating greater opportunity for people to engage in community. So how do we begin to sort of put this together into something more cogent for us, right? I mean, this was just an overview of community mapping as a process, as a tool, how it's been used, what are some of the elements to think about in a broader sense of community. However, we also want to recognize that there may be other things in community that are not so easily or quickly discovered, and that we have to dig around a little bit more for. For example, on this slide, you'll see on the third bullet says meetup.com, right? Now, Meetup is a social networking inventory, right? It's a website. If you go to the website, you log in to meetup.com, And when you log in, it asks, you get prompted to identify an area you're interested in meeting people around. Could be animals, could be reading, could be music, whatever you're interested in. You type that into the homepage along with your zip code, and then up comes the clubs, groups, and associations that have been aligned in meetup.com. In a way, meetup.com has already mapped some of the interest groups that are in your community. So recognizing that already there are some inventories, there are some, you can do a Google search on something, and discover what might be out there that might not have been in plain sight to you, or just observing, just being sensitive to some of the clues of community that you see in just observation. So recognizing that mapping is a strategic process, and really thinking about how can we use mapping, or how can you use mapping to discover what might be an incredible resource, potential resource for someone who has been either left behind or limited in being exposed to community. So here we go back again to this process and these actions. So in our case in Sault Ste. Marie, just to use that as an example, we've identified a target group. We have 10 people that the organization serves who live in Sault Ste. Marie, in various parts of Sault Ste. Marie. And that's our target group. And what we want to do with the information is we want to find resources that might correspond with these 10 people that we've identified. Right. So what we're doing right now, actually, in this project, is we're looking at any previous studies or information that has been done in these various places in Sault Ste. Marie. And then we're going to set up a plan to collect information geographically sort of identified for our target group. So again, this is sort of a process where you back into how you want to use mapping to really facilitate somebody that your agency serves, or someone in particular that might benefit from community resources. And then you begin to identify what are the assets in your community, and then you put it together in terms of an action plan to get people from where they're at now in their target area to begin to get engaged in a new experience that they might not have been done before. Right? So with that intentionality in mind, you can then, going back to that, you can fit in whomever you're interested in, or your organization's interested in, getting more engaged in community, right? And once you've identified why are we doing this, like what is it going to be used for, then it moves you to say, okay, what information do we need to collect, right? What do we need to learn, and how are we going to collect that information about the community? Are we going to run a focus group? Are we going to interview people? We're going to do like a man on the street interview, where we just stop someone and ask them questions about that community that they're living in. You can even do forums, things like world cafes. We've been talking about a world cafe in Westerville, the possibilities of doing a world cafe where we can bring in people who really help identify some of these resources. pre-existing data sets, things that are out there. United Ways in communities have done some mapping. Community development groups, civic groups have done some mapping. All of that stuff, if you can identify it, begin to bring it in, it really can help in your own process. You don't have to reinvent the wheel in order to really make this work. So for our purposes, and for purposes I've done with other groups, here's a little bit of an overview of some of the things that we're looking to gather. And I'm gonna show this to you in this tool. Now, I sent this up to Sue and Deb and Jamie, and hopefully they've dispersed it to you. But this is a assessment tool. It's just a one-page overview of a community resource, right? And so once a resource is identified, that then what we've done is we've dispatched a staff member to go and chronicle or codify the information. For example, working with a group up near the Erie area of Pennsylvania, and so we've been doing a community mapping process there, and let me give one example. We've identified, for example, a garden club called the Buell Garden Club in this particular community. So by using this form, we say the name of the venue is the Buell Gardening Club. The activity at the venue is weekly meetings and occasional opportunities to work the gardens at the Buell Mansion, where the Buell Gardening Club meets. The contact name and the gatekeeper name. Now, the gatekeeper name is really someone that we think might be a receptacle for us in the Buell Gardening Club. So we want to identify who might be a person that really would be welcoming, right? Next session, next month, when we talk about infrastructure, we're going to talk much more about gatekeepers, and we're going to actually do an exercise on identifying gatekeepers. But then further down this list, as you see on the slide, check all that apply, right? Is it accessible? Is there accessible parking? Do you have to pay for parking? Is it outdoor, indoor? Is there climate control, right? Is there comfortable seating for, the things that they do? Do you have to pay a dues to become a member? And then some impressions. People at this venue seem to be friendly and warm, closed off, cold, reserved, right? It was just an assumption of how soft is this resource, this Buell Gardening Club. And the activity is formal, informal, quiet, loud. Again, all this gathering of information about this community resource is to not just map this resource for future use, but to really think about somebody in our target group that might be interested in gardening that would fit, that there would be a intersection for them. Okay? So, these kinds of forms allow us to learn more about the community resource, right? And begin to put that into our database. And the database that we're developing at the program we're doing up near Erie is really, we're putting it in a database for staff to be able to gather, but also we're putting it in a scrapbook so that persons that they serve, especially folks with significant intellectual disabilities and cognitive issues, might be able to look at the scrapbook and see a picture that's displayed about the resource. So again, mapping you can be as creative as you want in terms of the maps that you develop, right? One other example here is identifying an association. And here's an example, as you can see on this notion, where the Michigan Humane Society, the Detroit Center for Animal Care was the community resource identified. The next column was, what do they do? Animal protection. The charity, the delineation of the resource, an address, a phone, an email. This is another variation of codifying resources in the community. You don't know when you might be able to use that, or when there might be really the need to get somebody plugged into an animal, rescue group, right? But having it mapped, identifying where it's at, knowing that it exists, and then updating it and refreshing the information to make sure that the map stays current. Because just like any other map, things change, things go out of business, new things pop up, and so we want to not just develop the map, but we want to make sure that the map retains its integrity by refreshing it, by identifying some things new that have happened there, changes that have occurred. Right? Now, displaying the information, I mentioned this group in Erie is using a scrapbook. You can also have an electronic database where you kind of keep things there. The electronic database can actually prompt you, at certain intervals to make sure that you're keeping information on your community map vibrant and viable. Things can be put in display cards. Actual places that have developed maps, actual maps of their community with little pins that represent, various resources in that community. So again, the display can be as creative as you want it to be, but the mapping process begins to yield some real benefits, right? Targets, mostly places that you can begin to go to with people you're supporting in an effort to begin to get that person connected. And once a person gets connected, that really sets the table for relationships. It doesn't mean that people are going to automatically build a relationship when they join a community resource that you've identified in a mapping process. But before you can be of the party, you got to be in the party. And the mapping process identifies the potential resources for people to begin to engage. Once people begin to engage, how they get supported, we're gonna talk about that in the infrastructure session next month. How we can soften the community infrastructure, how we can enhance the possibility that the person that we're supporting will become vibrant in that community resource. Right. So the notion of thinking about this gets me to this Burton Black quote. Burton Black, tremendous thinker and innovator in inclusive community out of Syracuse University, and said, since the beginning of the human experience, man has behaved as if freedom means more to him than his life. Yet, even more important to him has been the need to belong to community. Right? That notion of being a part of a community. Because once you're in the community, relationships will begin to form. And as relationships begin to form, the pro-social behaviors of that community go up. It becomes softer. It becomes more respectful and more willing to, to engage with folks. Schweitzer said, the first step in the evolution of ethics is a sense of solidarity with other human beings, right? If you don't have solidarity with people, it's pretty easy to treat them unethically. And that whole notion of devaluing and diminishing the impact of others in our community. Putnam says if you belong to no community and you decide to join one, you cut your risk of dying in half over the next year. Robert Putnam, Harvard sociologist, has really looked a lot at social capital. We talked a little bit about him last webinar series, but clearly, belonging to community breeds life. It sustains people. It brings out the best in people, right? Finding these places is the community mapping process, because the key pro-social traits for change are all really basic. What creates a softer culture? And again, we'll look at this in greater detail next month at our session on community infrastructure. But these kinds of elements really are part and parcel of creating a softer community. And so let me just wrap this up, and then what we can do is open it up for some questions. I know there's probably still some questions in the chat room, and maybe any live questions we can cover. When we try to bring about change in our societies, we're treated first with indifference, then with ridicule, then with abuse, and then with oppression. And finally, the greatest challenge is thrown at us. We're treated with respect. This is the most dangerous stage. And I think what this is sort of a wake-up call about the constant need to tend to our communities. And so let me just finish with this little story. This is a quote from R. Patrick McMurphy, who was a character in a book by Ken Kesey called One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And some of you may have read the book, or maybe saw the movie of the same name starring Jack Nicholson. But the storyline of the book, the storyline of the movie, was about a hellraiser by the name of R. Patrick McMurphy, who got into some trouble in town and plea bargained with the judge rather than go to jail, to go to a mental health facility. And he thought going to a mental health facility would be the easy way out. He wouldn't have to worry about being incarcerated. He could hustle his way through this, and so he gets committed to a mental health facility, and there he meets Nurse Ratched, who is worse than a prison warden, and comes to discover that it's more oppressive than had he gone to jail. And so he decides that he just wants to get the hell out of there, that he made a mistake. And so one day they're sitting in the day room, all the inmates, all the patients, and he says to them, I'm gonna get out of here. I'm gonna leave. Anybody want to come with me? And all the guys, all the patients, they're saying, Mac, you can't leave. We're locked in here. We're committed. You just can't leave. He said, I know that we're committed. He said, but I'm gonna pull that sink out of the wall. They were sitting in the day room. There was a sink there. I'm gonna pull that sink out of the wall. I'm gonna throw it through the damn window, and then I'm gonna head into town. I'm gonna find me a woman. I'm gonna have a good time. I'm just gonna get the hell out of here. And the other patient said, Mac, you can't pull the sink off the wall. And McMurphy, played by Jack Nicholson in the movie, said, who wants to bet me? I can't do this. And these guys, their eyes get real wide, and they say, holy hell, they're committed, but they know a good bet when they hear one. So they said, we'll bet you, Mac. And he said, okay. And so they put cigarettes, which is the commodity of exchange in the mental health facility. They put cigarettes up on the table. And Jack Nicholson goes over to the sink, and he puts his arm around one side of the sink and down below the other part of the sink, and he starts pulling on the sink, right? And he's pulling and pulling and pulling, and he falls back. The sink is still on the wall. The guys say, "See, we told you, Mac, you couldn't do it." He said, boys, I was just warming up." And so he goes back over to the sink, spits on his hands, rubs them together, puts one hand underneath the sink and grabs the pipe, puts another hand on the other side of the sink where the faucet is. And now he has a good hold on the sink. And he starts pulling and shaking and pulling and shaking. And he's really exerting all this pressure. And then, the vein in his neck is popping on and the camera coming in close. And then the other end, the other patients are sitting there. Their eyes are really wide. They think, damn it, he's going to do it. He's going to pull this sink off the wall. And he falls back off to the ground. And the sink is still up on the wall. And the other patients say, Mac, we knew that you couldn't do that. Why did you even try? And he said, boys, at least I tried. That notion that doing something that is hard, something that is difficult, is really what community engagement is about. It's not about just fixing a disability and thinking, voila, this is all going to happen. It's about understanding community. It's about knowing and recognizing resources. It's about strategically identifying people to resources and then supporting them in a way that allows that person to become successful. And so community is a challenging puzzle, but the parts can be put together. And as long as we try. And so here's my contact information. We're going to open up. I'm going to close off my sharing, the information you have, where you can get in touch with me, how you can get in touch with me. I'm going to stop the sharing and we're going to open this up to any questions or comments that folks have about the community mapping process. So let me toss it over to Jamie. Jamie, is there anything in the chat room? I see we have a number of things that people have identified. Can you give us a summary of the question, and we'll try to engage it. We have about 20 minutes.
Okay, let's see here. We have a couple of questions regarding what is your direct experience in working with individuals with disabilities, how long, where? And then we have, does it matter how many people are in a group as you define community?
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Let's take both of those. First off, in terms of my own experience base, just a couple things. One is, and I think I identified some of this in our first session, but I've been a community advocate in disability issues from the time I was born. I live on a big Italian family on a hill. Grew up with my cousin Carrie, who had Down syndrome, and from the time we started to understand social issues, I was advocating for Carrie's involvement in community. And my experience with Carrie led me to a formal position in the field. After college, working first in a large institution here in Pittsburgh. I was there for 3 years, working to get people out of that institution and into the community. And I left there and went to a community-based organization known as UCP of Pittsburgh, United Cerebral Palsy of Pittsburgh. Rebranded that organization. I was there 47 years, the CEO for 27 of those 47 years. And we rebranded the organization as Community Living and Support Services from its previous name of UCP. Got my my master's degree in community organizing at the University of Pittsburgh School of Social Work. Got my doctorate in educational psychology and community influence at the University of Pittsburgh. That was in 1984. joined the faculty there in 1984. Still on the faculty, doing research and teaching. And now I retired from class just in 2019, and now I'm just doing some coaching and some training, and you know, and sharing of ideas like we're doing in this webinar. So that's my personal experience. To the question about the number of people in groups, obviously, the more people are grouped together, the worse it is. The more you create a stereotypic perception, you know, it just baits all the wrong things. So you know, the best scenario is an individual who's interested in something, whether they have a disability or not, gets connected to a resource that celebrates the issue, and that person, even if they need supports, participates, support folks who provide support, you know, like job coaches provide support in a work environment. Community coaches provide support in community environments. So so the support is rendered. Next session, we're going to talk about ways of supporting people in community that's softer and that doesn't give the wrong message, right? Because supporting people in the community is really to valorize them and their participation, rather than to bring attention to the support person. Support person is like a butler or a maid, man. They're just there to just make sure that the individual is you know, is comfortable and is able to participate, right? So we'll talk more about that next session. But I think we want to try to talk about just one-on-one situations here rather than groups of people. Okay. Other questions, Jean?
Yes, we have one. I have a young lady with disabilities who would like to create an app that will help people in identifying accessibility for local locations, restaurants, businesses. And mapping will be huge.
Yeah.
Any ideas on the best way to guide her?
Yeah. Wow. That is really a great question. And there's lots of new technology that's really helping with this. In fact, let me just share. There's you know, at the University of Pittsburgh in the School of Health and Rehab Sciences, where I have a faculty appointment, we have a part of our university called the Human Engineering Research Lab, right? And it's basically rehab engineers. These are all engineers that are designing things to make it easier for participation, right? And one of our graduate students in his thesis created a database, much like you're talking about, except it was a database called, he calls it PathView. And essentially what it looks to do is identifying accessible paths from where you live or where you are to where you'd like to go or like to be. And it looks at sidewalks and you know, curb cuts and you know, things, potholes in the sidewalks, and you know, especially in older cities like Pittsburgh, where you know, you have older communities, it's hilly. So what he's done with his his PathView app is, you know, create a you know, a path for someone to take to get to from where they are to where they want to be. And he has since added in, you know, accessible transportation kinds of things, buses, accessible routes for buses when they come. So he's really created, I think, a wonderful resource for people to participate. So you know, I think there's just great possibility and opportunity out there, especially with all the technology and the sensitivity to technology that we're just developing and discovering, for people to participate. And that's really the whole agenda here. of this entire webinar series is how can people participate and engage more meaningfully in their communities. Our session today was to discover what are the potential resources for engagement, right? And that's what happens in community mapping. Once they get identified, then really talking about what are the infrastructure pieces, and that's what we'll get into next session, that are critical to success in that venue. And so we'll talk about that. We'll actually have a couple little exercises that will help us try to walk our way through that. So other questions, Jamie?
Yes. Can you provide insight or guidance on getting people to buy in or encouraging the community and even our staff in a small rural nonprofit agency in which people still today have antiquated thinking in regards to individuals being active participants in the community as a whole?
Yeah, that's a powerful question. And whether it's in a small rural community or a more dense urban community, insensitivity of community members can be a barrier. And that's why the session we're going to talk about next week, we're calling it softening the social infrastructure, because how someone goes from being an outsider to becoming an insider and a respected participant requires that the players in that resource or in that community become more accepting and more hospitable and more welcoming to a newcomer. I mean, every one of us have been in situations where, when we've joined something, some people haven't really been that nice to us, that sensitive to us, that newcomers have difficulty being welcomed in existing community settings. I mean, I've been amazed at all the sort of efforts of getting folks involved in places, for example, like church, where you think people would be welcoming, in a church where, when the gospel tells us about love, you love the stranger and, see yourself in other people, and yet can be so damn unwelcoming and suspicious and petty, right? I mean, we all know that, and we've seen those kinds of things happen in our own lives, right? So you add in a dimension that's atypical for them, a dimension like a wheelchair, a dimension like a speech issue, whatever, and that setting can even become more rejecting. And so our session next month is really an important one, because we can do everything. We can say, okay, this person's been isolated, they need more social capital. We've mapped the community and identified this resource, and voila, just drop them off and everything's going to be great. Wow. You're just in the beginning stages of community building when you get to identifying the resource, because now our work really starts in earnest of how can that get softened and what makes a community more hospitable, right? And I want to talk a little bit about this conceptually next month, but more to identify some strategies on that. Now, it's not magic wand stuff, by the way. I wish that it was that easy. I wish we had a magic wand or an elixir that we could give somebody to drink and all of a sudden they're going to be nice. But the notion is you got to deal with what you got right now. And then how do we soften that? What are some of the things that can happen, right? So we'll get into more of that next month. Stay tuned. Other questions?
Yes.
We got about 10 minutes.
Lisa Combs says, Al, I met you many years ago and I'm so glad to hear you again. I unfortunately had to get on late, but it is so good to hear you again. I am currently the SSA advisor for Ohio Association of County Boards and am in charge of, oh, I'm in charge of determining statewide trainings and topics. Would love to touch base with you again. And then she provides her email address.
Oh, great. More business. That's right. That's wonderful. I'm happy to talk more about some things we could do together.
Alexandra has a question. I have learned a lot about individuals in the last year that has caused me to pause and rethink my connection with them. Do you think that the community, that the common in community has greatly shifted with the pandemic / social injustice?
Mhm. Yeah, that's really an interesting observation. I think the pandemic has, in fact, begun the softening process for all of us. I mean, this is, this kind of being restricted and distanced from people has really gotten all of us right in the face. And it's maybe in some ways it's the silver lining of the pandemic is that we have awakened to how important, it is to be engaged and to see people and to be with them and be a part of something bigger than just ourselves. And so can we ride that after the pandemic is over? I hope so. I think there might be some advantages. However, what we do know is that when there's been spikes in sensitivity, those spikes haven't lasted real long. Give an example, 9/11, right? When 9/11 occurred, in fact, Robert Putnam really chronicled this through a couple articles that he did. But when 9/11 occurred, right after 9/11, everyone was, given blood and, being sensitive to each other and really recognizing that life can change on a dime. And that softening, there was a spike in compassion right after 9/11. But then Putnam, chronicled the fact that spike started coming down and people started getting back into their, wearing their masks and doing the stuff that sometimes we do in hiding from one another. We're at a very divisive time right now, as we all know, where literally, I mean, we've got people polarized to a point where, people have tried to, take over the Capitol. And I mean, these are polarizing times. And so I think maybe the pandemic might be something that we can, in fact, utilize. And when we talk about softening next month, we'll kick around maybe how we might promote some of that. Great point, though. Good question. Anything else, Jamie?
Let's see
We have
here.
about 4 minutes.
I don't see any more coming into, let me check. We just got one. Oh, yes. As we find those who are co-supporters in helping an individual attain social capital, is it necessary to let that individual know who those supporters are?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the strategies, I think, in supporting people to participate more meaningfully in community really requires, I think, sort of a wraparound support team of people, because community happens, in the evenings, and it happens on the weekends, and community groups gather at various times, and so just having one staff member supporting the person all the time in that setting may not be realistic. It might not be viable, right? So creating a wraparound team for intervention is really, I think, the smartest thing to do in terms of promoting the individual's participation. Because one thing we know, and then we'll get into this a little bit more in the softening session next month, is that one of the things that softens community is regularity. If a person is just there again and again and again when that community meets, they just the regularity alone can cause other people to see more human characteristics of people who regularly come, even though they may look different or be different in some manifestation. So we want to assure that people have a chance to regularly participate. And so regular participation really requires that if we have a team of people who's supportive, that we can almost assure that that individual can have a chance to participate every time that group meets, even though the support person may differ from time to time.
I believe that's it for questions.
Okay, great. Well, we're just about out of time. Just one last thing, and I'll pitch it to Sue for a summary. I really, really appreciate you guys being here. I know that this was a little tedious because in some ways it gets us a little bit outside of, what we typically do and what we're comfortable with. But I think overviewing this notion of mapping is really an important part, because if we don't identify the targets, then we're just gonna be marking time, and meaningful engagements will never happen. So I appreciate you signing on and being a part of this, going through the tediousness. Thank you. And next month, I think we're set up for March 2nd, Tuesday, March 2nd at 10 o'clock. If you can join us, great. We're going to have some materials ahead of time that'll be sent out to you prior to that session. We're going to be looking at softening the social infrastructure. So I appreciate you being a part of this series and looking forward to seeing you next month. And Sue, let me just pitch it to you for a close.
Sure. Thank you, Al. This has been motivating and encouraging, and I'm really looking forward to the March session. I think we're moving to getting people where they're thinking about tools and what next steps are. And I would just encourage participants on these to shoot us an email about what's going on with you as a result of these. I know we're going to have evaluations that could go on there too, but just shooting any one of us an email about what's happening would be super for us to know. So we'll look forward to seeing you on March 2nd. Just a reminder, you do have to register for each one of these sessions individually. And have a good day. Stay warm and safe out there.
Thanks, Sue. Thanks, guys. Be well.